So the production of biological therapies is complex. It requires essentially large-scale production, either in cells or bacteria or proteins. And intrinsically, there is a cost here of producing a high-quality goods, which raise the production costs to a level that is not seen with chemical drugs. So, for example, the average cost of anti-TNF therapy per annum in the UK is £15,000, okay, which is a lot of money. So it's not surprising that there is a global divide in those who can afford such medicines, where the state or the insurance company payer is able to fund such therapies. And there are constraints. So in the UK, for example, it is mandated that you have to fail at least 2 DMARDs before you can qualify for a biological therapy. This is a form of rationing, but it's an entirely reasonable form of rationing because actually, as I said earlier, I think DMARDs that are affordable do work. So I think it's not only an issue of economics, but also of understanding that the majority of patients actually can be controlled with affordable drugs. And there is a minority that, for example, in the developing world, will never be able to afford that sort of cost of drugs. Is there a solution? I think there is. The true cost of drugs, of biological drugs, is of course less than the commercial price. The commercial price is geared to make profit. And the profit is to recoup the expenses that the companies claim that they incurred in developing research, but also in shareholder value. So I think that even if the patent situation which protects companies' products start running out, which they're beginning to run out, and so-called biogeneric drugs become available, and they will become available because companies in Asia, for example, are producing such lookalikes. The cost of those sort of biosimilars will still be significant. And at a rough guess, it might be somewhere between 50 to 70% of the current cost of the biologic that these companies are charging. I think that still remains unaffordable. So in the long term, my belief is that chemical drugs have to be found that actually target the mechanisms that we are beginning to understand more and more. And there is reason to believe that targeting, for example, intracellular signaling pathways will produce such drugs that are affordable. So I think in the long term, biologicals aren't going to be the answer. Prevention of disease is cheaper. If we begin to understand how you prevent rheumatoid arthritis, for example, how you prevent cancer, that's going to be hugely cost-saving. Well, I'm a huge fan and supporter of open access. So when Vitek Trach approached me from BioMed Central in 1998 or 99 with these exciting ideas on open access, I thought it really was something that the academic community should support, because it's so frustrating when, as a research worker, you have difficulty in accessing literature. You know, in the past, we used to get hundreds of reprint requests. Okay, so every time you published a paper, you got your department to pay for 100 or 200 reprints, because predictably, for any article that made any kind of impact, there would be requests on postcards coming to you asking for a free reprint, because people were just unable to access these journals, which are very expensive. And unless you belong to a university that was able to afford access to these journals, and even many universities were unable to, there was a significant lack of ability to get hold of original published work. I must say, when Vitek talked about it, I thought this was not going to work, because there are a lot of vested interests of publishing companies in the business model that leads to profit being made on publications. But if you think about it, the publisher is relying on scientists to A, do the work, B, send their paper to the publisher, C, the same community of scientists is refereeing the work and reviewing it for free, and the paper is published by a publishing company, and who makes the money? The publisher. Okay? I think intrinsically that's immoral. So for progress of science, that kind of information should be available to everybody freely. That is the counsel of perfection. But obviously, publications cost money. So there has to be a model that allows, a business model that allows free access, but is somehow a sufficient incentive for a publisher to use. Have we found the ideal solution there? I'm not sure. I think we're getting there, because all open access original research is now accessible in journals that have open access policy, and there are more and more of them. I understand there's been a huge increase in the number of people that use open access. That's great. So I think there is an increasing feeling underlined by certain rather unpleasant instances of information on clinical trials on certain drugs that was withheld or misused in reporting, which has consequences for patients, which are not good. So I'm absolutely convinced that there has to be a transparency in the data that is collected and used in clinical trials. But you know, having taken part in clinical trials, I can tell you that this data has to be transparent but also understandable. If you put from any one clinical trial the entire database onto the web, frankly, nobody would understand it, because it needs interpretation. It needs careful analysis, and it needs classification so that you understand what data was collected, why it was collected, how it might be interpreted. But certainly on the side of side effects and adverse events, which is, I think, where this transparency is especially needed, this business of risk versus benefit. You know, there's a balance always with drugs. All drugs have side effects and adverse events, and you're balancing the drug for every patient, making a choice, and they have to be taking part in that choice, what we call informed consent. And I think for that to work properly, you need transparency of data, so that not only the person that has done the research or the company that has sponsored it has done largely all drugs, essentially in the end, require big money, and that big money comes from companies. So not only the company should have hold of that information, but other people should be able to examine it and test whether that information has been correctly interpreted. I don't think that's easy, and often there are controversies, even in the interpretation of data. So I don't think we should be beating the drum that all companies are crooked and this information is suspect and therefore we need transparency. I think that actually mostly companies are ethical, but there are fringes which are not, or because it's a complex process involving lots of other people, trialists, marketing people who are remote from the people who did the actual clinical trial. There can be many, many paths leading to perdition, difficulties. So transparency, yes, but also means to be able to understand what that transparency allows you to do intelligently.